Alrighty. We ready to go, Ben?
I'm ready if you are.
Absolutely. Let's take off. Um, so thank you for joining. This is our first YouTube stream through demand from the community. We decided also to get this one recorded. So if you're joining us after it being recorded, also welcome to you. But we've also got some people live in Discord as well. So as usual, if anyone's got any questions throughout our kind of conversation, feel free to jump in. We'll also give you the opportunity to talk as well if you want, or feel free to just drop the questions in the Discord channel. Unfortunately, this time we do have YouTube comments disabled, but we'll be looking to get that sorted and up and running for next time, so we can have questions from both Discord and the YouTube channel. But for the links, obviously, if you do want to join our Discord and you're joining us through YouTube, it's huntr.dev/Discord. All the links are underneath the stream. If you're not too sure where to get those, just check the description, and you'll be directed to our website, probably our Discord, and any other relevant links that you need. But it's good to be doing this live. I mean, we kind of started this just on Discord, didn't we, Ben? So it's nice to kind of get this more formal, get it pre-recorded and out for people who can't necessarily join us live.
Yeah, and yeah, there'll be a recording afterwards. So for anyone that's missed out, they'll be able to look back and listen again if you happen to drop out, or if you're looking to listen later on again. This will be available on YouTube.
Awesome, brilliant. Well, let's jump straight into it. I think the most obvious thing to probably address, and I heard the guys talking about it at work today. I can bring it onto the screen as well, and we've even got the innovation of screen share this time. How great! Um, so we've got prominent security expert Dan Kaminski passed away at 42. Obviously, I wish the best to him, to his family. Um, but I hadn't actually heard too much about Dan Kaminski before. I mean, I'd heard the name and that he was fairly prominent in the community, and that he'd done a lot for like InfoSec. I mean, had you heard much about Dan Kaminski before, Ben? Or
I hadn't, unfortunately, and like it's a shame that I hadn't kind of heard about him until today because he's obviously had such a big impact on the community.
yeah, yeah.
So I'm very interested in kind of hearing more about him and his contributions.
Yeah, no doubt, no doubt, and it's actually nice to see. It's good to see that more prolific. What could you call it? Like news articles or news article websites are talking about it, and I think this kind of follows on from conversations that we've had in the past, which is that things around cybersecurity, around open source, around hacking, around bug bounty, it's starting to become more and more common in the news. You know how AI kind of became a big thing in the news around the world. Everyone's talking about driverless cars. Everyone's talking about the next and the best technology, whether it's scary or it's going to change the world. I think for sure cybersecurity has definitely been in the news, but I think it's good also to some extent that we're also respecting people who have innovated in this space as well, and we're talking about them and we're looking back at their careers and seeing how they innovated, what they did for corporations, what they did for open source communities, non-profits, all this kind of stuff. So I think it's really awesome to see that we're also looking at these people in our communities and paying our respects. I think that's really nice. And I think it shows a promising future for sure. But yeah,
Yeah, no, it's good to see that people are being recognized in the space, and like unfortunately in this case it's uh in a death, but I mean
yeah,
like the impact he's had on the community and what he's done in the past in terms of protecting our networks and finding vulnerabilities, has had a big impact on people in a very positive way. Um, so as much as it's a very sad day for him to be passing away, the kind of impact that he's left behind is still very much there and being recognized.
yeah, for sure, for sure. Well, just quoting, yeah, ZDNet. Yeah, in 2008, Kaminski revealed a fundamental flaw in the domain name system DNS, as we probably more commonly know it, at the Black Hat Security Conference in Las Vegas, leading to a multi-vendor coordinated patch release. I mean, that's big deal, right? Like if it's affecting something as critical as DNS. Um, while well known for his work on DNS, Kaminski has worked in the cybersecurity field for decades and also acted as an advisor for a number of Fortune 500 companies. So obviously it had a massive impact, right? Like maybe kind of a Steve Jobs of the cybersecurity industry. So certainly very sad to see someone like this leaving us. But I think obviously through his work, through his innovation, through sharing his passion for things like InfoSec and application security and maybe a bit of open source, this will certainly inspire more people in the future to kind of pick it up and for sure improve society with it. So yeah, very sad. But I guess taking a kind of a side tour, a detour from that. Where did we leave off last week? I mean, we discussed things like getting started with open source bug bounty. We discussed getting started with huntr.dev, and we also discovered some of the problems that is finding vulnerabilities in open source packages. Of course, understanding and accepting that this can be quite difficult for people who are looking to get started, not only in the industry, people who are looking for jobs, but maybe just for enthusiasts who maybe want to make a bit of side money whilst they're doing maybe university or they're doing their main job. And of course, it's a complex issue, right? This is why we've got GitHub addressing it. We have all of the kind of maintainers of these big packages that can be concerned about it as well. But we are seeing, it's not necessarily an easy issue to solve, right? And we know that. And that's why, it's important for us to kind of address ways that we can together as a community look to find these vulnerabilities, right? And we kind of touched on last week that just like the scale of open source has created this incredible ecosystem of amazing packages that do X, Y, and Z, whether that's Vue.js or React or Lodash, a big wide-ranging set of functionalities, whether it's web frameworks, whether it's some utilities library, whether it's a CMS, whether it's a login system, right? We can see that for sure, open source is having a massive effect on the world. And we were starting to question, with regards to Huntr and huntr.dev, can we build up a community that similarly can address the issue of security in open source, right? Which we believe, certainly, our team and our community believe that it's going to take a community to rally around this and behind it to address such a global phenomena, which is, open source and its vulnerabilities, right? So, where do we think we're on that, Ben?
Yeah, so I think like security is becoming more like people are becoming more and more aware of it. But unfortunately, in open source, certainly when I first started with Huntr, it, security wasn't as much of a priority, or it wasn't as a, people weren't as aware of like the impact that can because when a vulnerability is exposed and somebody takes advantage and exploits that vulnerability. Because as you've mentioned, open source is powerful. It's used by millions of people, big corporations, businesses. It's adopted so widely. So as much as we're kind of security aware outside of open source, it's time to start protecting open source code because it is so widely used.
Yeah,
And as you can see, even on the huntr.dev webpage, you see these big companies like Spotify, Microsoft, Nvidia, and these are everyday products that people are using. So not only are we protecting software, we're protecting the people that are using this software as well. So it's a very much a cascading effect
yeah, for sure.
when people are contributing to the platform.
Yeah, definitely. And one of the things that I saw this week, or maybe it was just coming out of last week, was a email or a letter that Nat Friedman from GitHub, CEO of GitHub, sent out around the Mars helicopter Ingenuity. And one of the big things that GitHub was talking about was the fact that obviously, Ingenuity, it's obviously using software. I would be very surprised, and naturally, it is using open source software. And they were sending out these badges to different communities and maintainers on GitHub where their repository or their code had been used in the building and the maintenance, the software used to fly Ingenuity, which is incredible. And maybe not just necessarily flying it, but also doing things like network communication, anything to do with, I don't know, interfacing different components. Whatever it is, it was awesome to see that not only are we seeing almost the space industry become a lot more accessible? It's becoming more minimal. It's becoming easier to understand. It's becoming more common for people to talk about it because it's more in the news. It's associated with companies and names that we're more interested in. You've got the Elon Musk, you've got the SpaceX, and it's linking with other companies like Tesla. It's really cool also to see that open source communities, people who are putting their time and effort outside of their day work and their day jobs into something that is potentially being used on Mars. And I think this really, really kind of spells and demonstrates the impact that anyone in open source can have. And we can kind of get onto the security aspect of that in a second, right? Because obviously, just as an open source maintainer or someone who's opened a pull request on GitHub can get their code, deployed to Mars for all intents and purposes, in the same light, right? We could theorize and say, well, who knows? Maybe there's a vulnerability on Mars, right? Like, imagine that. I mean, I think we'd be almost silly to assume that all of the open source software that's being used on Mars does not, is not zero, is not hack free. There's always a way through, I think, in regards to software, open source software. So imagine the kind of the milestone of being able to say, I found a vulnerability, or I found the first vulnerability on Mars, or I found and fixed the first vulnerability on Mars. But this very much demonstrates the impact that I think open source has had, for sure, in the last 15 years, and since it's become a lot more popular, moving away from proprietary software. I think it's obviously clear generally over the last few years how much of an impact it's had, with organizations moving quickly, with organizations themselves also adopting an open source mantra. Facebook, them building their own web framework, other companies also investing in open source software and sharing it with the rest of the world, right? So it's almost a change of culture, it's a change of opinion around proprietary, right? And even if we look back to the big guns in software, right? So we're looking at Microsoft. They had a really strong stance on open source software. Before it was kind of really where it is today, and it was quite a negative opinion. I think it was coming from I believe it was Steve Ballmer or Brad Bird, or maybe even both, and they had quite a negative opinion of open source software, and they thought it was it was the apocalypse of software. And I think since they've admitted that they were wrong, and fair enough. Like, everyone's wrong about many things, but it's just really interesting to see such a wide shift away from something such as proprietary software into something like open source software. And although we may not necessarily see it today and think, it's crazy how much it's changed, how much we're using open source software in, when we check out at a shop, right? The registers, we've moved away from manual registers, the checkout, the thing that goes ding, and now we're all using contactless mini kind of checkout hubs, which are connected to the internet, which are doing transaction tracking, which is sending emails, right? And it would be remiss of us, it would be silly of us again to think that this in no way is not using open source software, because it absolutely is. And why is it? Because the companies who are developing these applications, who have recognized this innovation, they're using it to move quickly. They're using it because they can reproduce quite significant functions and interfaces very quickly because they've already been developed. And of course, the open source software allows them to be able to customize them quickly for their use cases. And so it's cascading across the rest of society. It's really funny. Like, even as I've grown up in the shops I've gone into, you've really seen the progression of moving away from more manual machines that are clearly somewhat outdated. And it's sure that it was probably using some level of open source software at that time. But I think it's more likely that the contractors, the companies who are building the machines and shops and the checkout systems, and anything you see with hardware that's likely to be using software, it's more likely that this software was built in-house. A lot of the functionality inside of the hardware, the cameras, whatever it is, was built from more from scratch. As opposed to today, we've put our faith, almost you could say like a blind faith, which is really fascinating, in this international community of hackers, of software developers, of mathematicians, data scientists, of physicians, really anything, right? Like, it would be really awesome to look a bit more into the state of the Oxiverse, so GitHub's reports where they talk about who their users are, where they're from. But I think it's something that we're seeing, that open source is almost becoming, an internet of itself, in the sense that, of course, it's already on the internet. Of course, the resources that are shared on GitHub, on GitLab, and Bitbucket, and all the other VCS systems are shared around the world. But I think it's interesting to see that more and more people from wider communities are joining these sorts of platforms, right? We're also seeing these platforms admitting that they want people to get started. They want people who don't necessarily have experience with, software or coding, or don't necessarily know everything about, how to build a website, or how REST APIs work, or what hacking is. But they want people to come and get started and learn about it as they're embracing the community. And I think this is very much sort of a work in the shadows, that open source software has really taken a grasp on society, and it still very much is. It's developing. So we will see it absolutely more in the things that are used in our society, whether it's, the new Amazon Fresh stores. So, right, so one was open near me. And I mean, it's incredible, right? So, you walk in, you scan your app as you walk in. That's the Amazon Fresh store. Let's go to images. Cool. Okay, so here, so I'll show you the terminal. Yeah, so you walk in, you've got your Amazon app. Of course, we all know the Amazon app is pretty well built, for sure. You've got a QR code. You walk through, you scan it, and then that's basically it. You're done, right? The transaction has essentially occurred, which is there is knowledge that you're in the shop. They have a card on file which they can charge any sort of thing that you pick up in there, right? And then you can basically walk out. So on the roofs, you may see all of these kind of like framings where they'll have these cameras, and it's really awesome. So you can go up to absolutely anything in the shop, you can pick it up, right? And their cameras will be able to track you. Now, I'm not 100% sure, I haven't done enough reading into how it works, whether it's something like pattern recognition, whether it's using computer vision, or it's using things like inference and probability. Maybe it's a mix of all these sorts of things, but wouldn't quote me on any of this. But it's fantastic. You pick anything up, even if you just grasp two things, right? Let's say you're picking up two apples, which you think you could obscure with your hand. Let's say you pick up two apples, it'll still know that you've picked up two apples. Even if you put it in your pocket, you put it in your bag, straight away, just go to the exit, the other gate opens, the one in red at the other side, which is green for when you're leaving, and that's it. Like, you just walk out, you're done, right? And again, we would be very remiss to assume that this is not using open source software, right? Where previously we walk into a shop, of course, there may be a bit of, old kind of architecture and cameras and hardware and proprietary software to kind of, I don't know, maybe open the doors when you're going into the store. But more likely, right, it was something more hardware-based, whether it was something like a laser or LiDAR or whatever it is, right, more hardware-based. But we can see that software especially, and again, we'd be remiss to assume that they're not using open source software, is literally ingraining itself into every single thing that we do in society. Whether it's going to the shops to buy food from Amazon Fresh, and maybe it's not going to be Amazon Fresh, right? Maybe it's going to be any store, whether it's, in the UK, Tesco or Sainsbury's, or in the US, whether it's the Walmarts or Target, who knows? I think we will be moving away from this more proprietary approach, and we will be not necessarily seeing, but I think we can say, for sure that these companies will be adopting open source to kind of help them reach these end goals, which is someone wants to walk into a shop, they don't want to have this whole experience of, checking out, they just want to walk in and they want to walk out, right? But of course, with Amazon Fresh in mind, right, which is an incredible shopping experience. You're in, you're out, you pick up anything you want, you can even put it back. And of course, the Mars helicopter, right? So we're seeing really awesome innovations here. And again, probably got open source software in it. We know Ingenuity has, because of the letter that Nat Freeman sent out. Again, Amazon Fresh Store, I mean, obviously they use a lot of open source software. There's been some controversial mentions about AWS and Amazon using open source software, but naturally, I'm sure that they use it for these sort of applications and use cases as well. But fundamentally, I think we can agree that in these use cases, in building these sort of autonomous stores and building these helicopters that are on different planets, right? I think it's safe to assume that it's likely there is vulnerabilities in these open source components that are being used to serve these services, right? And I think this is certainly something we cannot ignore. I think just as much as the open source community naturally, whether it was through force or just some sort of natural evolution, came to be as it is today, I would hope that we see a similar thing around open source security, right? Because we've seen the effects of open source vulnerabilities impacting society, right? Whether it's an attack on India Post, whether it's something to do with solar winds, and not necessarily fully clear this was an open source attack, but of course you can have things like supply chain attacks where it could in theory be part of it. If the attacker knows that, I don't know, on some machine some sort of open source software package is being used, is there a way to help them continue their exploit through the chain? Maybe, maybe not, right? But as we adopt more and more of this open source software, we can say to an extent, this stuff is in the open, right? It's being built by incredible innovators. It's being built and maintained by people who are new to the scene. It's being built and maintained by people from very different walks of life, which all are incredible things, right? And that's why we're getting such amazing results, such as an awesome helicopter on Mars, and some guy from who knows where now has their code on Mars. Amazing. Okay, next, we've also got autonomous shops. You go in, you pick up anything, you put it back, you do it a million times, you walk out, still knows exactly what you've picked up, and it knows how to charge you, right? Amazing applications. But what is the risk here? And are we even aware of the risk? And again, the fact that I always kind of repeat, and I think it would be good to get more clarity on this, and it was something I heard a few years ago, was that companies are not necessarily taking security as seriously as they should be. Of course, in countries we're seeing more data protection. We're seeing laws being put in place as governments and economies and communities around the world are starting to realize the value of data. As we mentioned last week, Ben, we looked at what was it? Tim Berners-Lee new project. It's like the Internet 2.0, and still not had a massive opportunity to take a look at it. But even they're addressing this idea that your data is central to your experience on the internet. It's central to your experience with any sort of application or service that's using software. So we can at least say that data software is very much being taken more seriously versus where we were in the days of more proprietary software where we let the companies take care of it. We didn't worry too much if our data was being leaked. Maybe the companies didn't even really know. And I think to an extent it's good that we're seeing movements around companies as well, governments looking to address these issues, right? Whether it's through regulation or taking regulation away, I'm not necessarily strongly opinionated on those points, but I think it's good at least that there's a conversation occurring around, okay, now society is using software everywhere. It's on it's on the moon, it's on Mars, it's in our shops now. It's tracking your hands. It's tracking the colors of the clothes you're using when you walk in. Who knows? I'm not saying that's necessarily how it works, but there's very much more of a data-led experience with regards to using services and applications around the world now. And I think we'll see this increase. So the question is, will we also see society take the security of this stuff seriously as well, right? And again, I think we're in the kind of the wave of it at the moment, which is organizations are very scared of vulnerabilities to an extent. Some aren't necessarily at all. I think you'll maybe see it more at the top end where, if they have a leak, there's a lot more pressure on them because they have billions of users. So whether that's the Facebooks, the Twitters, the Snapchats, they don't really want to be mentioned in some article on the news where they've lost 500 million records of user data. Okay, it takes a reputation hit. But I think at the same time, we're also seeing companies taking positions where they're saying, okay, well, can we afford that? Maybe it's fine that we take those reputational hits and we just keep pushing and pushing and pushing forward with deploying new features, experimenting with our users, giving them a better service. But I think whether it's virtue signaling or not, I think it's very important that companies do address this issue. And I think it's important that they do take more of a proactive stance on the vulnerabilities in their proprietary software, whether they're still using it, but obviously their open source software as well. And we've mentioned this previously, right? Which is, there are solutions out there which will help you more so with your open source management. They'll address issues with regards to what sort of vulnerability is in this package, and where can you find a vulnerability in that package. But I think the issue is with these solutions, right? And I'm not trying to throw dirt on them, right? Because I think, of course, there's innovations here. I think it's good even that companies are using these solutions and somewhat taking a stance on security. But the issue is that we're playing with a game here that's so significant, right? You install an open source package, right? How many other open source packages do you actually depend on for that installation? Now, I think the developer may have a bit more information in this, but I think as you go up the ranks of the company, it becomes less and less clear, right? It can become very difficult to track this information. Do you really want lots and lots, hundreds and hundreds of alarms saying, okay, you just installed, I don't know, some package which is a web framework. Oh, and by the way, you also installed 200 other packages and 50 of them have vulnerabilities in them. Can someone really deal with those alarms? Or is it something that we can address earlier on? You know? Maybe that's the same question they were asking themselves when it came to proprietary software. Like we just spent 12 months building all of this from scratch. It is an application for hospitals. This contract is worth $1 billion, but this isn't actually what they want, right? And then we saw a move away from proprietary software, and then also a move towards more agile methodologies of developing software. Not thinking in the 12 months frame, not saying, okay, give us 12 months and then we'll deliver it, right? It creates an uncomfortability. And I think that is something that companies are somewhat feeling. And of course, it can take a certain shift in mindset for those things to move away, right? For people to move from proprietary to open source, but also to move away from reactive security to more proactive security, right? And there's this whole terminology, which Ben we've discussed with the team many times, and Adam's mentioned quite a lot, with regards to the idea of shifting left, right? As a developer, you're installing through NPM, you're installing through Pipey, you're installing through Golang, you're installing through Ruby Gems, through Maven. You're using your package managers, you're working with your programming languages that you're comfortable with. Is there really that much you can do as an individual? Bar, obviously, some of these open source management solutions, which will give you these alarms and tell you what the vulnerability is and maybe tell you what to patch to. Is this the answer? And to be sure, I'd argue no. I think it's great, obviously, that developer has now, okay, they've patched 50 vulnerabilities, or they patched a few vulnerabilities in some packages or some child dependencies that they're using at their organization. Okay, great, thumbs up. But I mean, where does that leave us with the rest of the companies, the developers, the enthusiasts, the hobbyists that are using this package? Of course, great. Okay, thumbs up. Maybe it was Facebook that caught this vulnerability. Okay, so we can safely say maybe there's 1 billion users around this mark. It's going up, it's going down. Not 100% sure on the count, so don't quote me on that. But okay, great. Let's say Facebook patched this. We're not going to lose 100 million records this month. Okay, awesome. In the event that maybe had they not patched it, it could have resulted in some sort of open source supply chain attack or some sort of denial of service, who knows, cross-site scripting, whatever it is, prototype pollution, whatever. Imagine to your heart's content. Okay, so of course, I think that's a good thing. But we're still missing the kind of the fundamental part, which is the package itself is to an extent still insecure, right? And I think we are starting to see the tiptoes of people addressing, okay, well, what about the open source package itself? Are we really comfortable moving back a version so the vulnerability is not there, and then we've got to rewrite all of our code? Okay, so then the benefit is, okay, our code's not vulnerable, but the massive drawback is, and companies really do not want this, is we've now got to reconsider about repatching, reorganizing our code because the API for this open source package no longer works. Because we've bumped back to a version where, I don't know, none of the names of the functions are the same, or there's no longer a function available in the most recent, in the previous version that we can use for our software. So we've got to spend time rewriting our code, we've got to delay our release, right? And this is not what companies want to do. So what's great about this is what? We've identified that companies do actually care about the open source vulnerabilities, of course. Of course, the companies care about moving quickly, but maybe they don't necessarily realize that fundamentally, if we do get these patches to the open source community, in the medium to the long run, it will actually help them move quickly. Right? Because they don't necessarily always factor in these ideas, which is we may have to repatch, we may have to rewrite our software, delay the delivery, and therefore okay, now we can't test a new improved version of Snapchat because of this issue. We've got to wait for a patch, or we've got to wait for the engineers and the QA to rebuild it, for them to re-quality assurance it, retest it, and then deploy it, okay? And of course, as users of these products, we don't necessarily see the end products of this. We're more so speaking as developers right now, people who are playing in the realm of CI/CD, site reliability, quality assurance, software development, okay? So we're playing in the realm of that kind of funnel where the corporations are hiring developers, they're hiring quality assurance engineers, they're hiring product engineers, they're hiring site reliability engineers, whatever it is, and they're saying, look, this is what we want to test with our users. This is a new feature we want to offer. Of course, we haven't got all the time in the world. Let's put it through this agile scrum. Let's build it. Let's get it out. Let's get it designed, and let's push it out as quickly as we can. Okay, and that is for sure, like whether we want to say it or not, that's the stuff that makes these companies money, right? But of course, forget Facebook for a second. These are also the services that make up society now, as we've just said. Of course, we're talking about more, cool, more shiny ideas here, which is Ingenuity, Helicopter, and the Amazon Fresh store. But more and more, we've got our hospitals using open source software. And in the same way, you're seeing them adopt more agile methodologies, which is a great thing. But the question is, are they addressing their open source vulnerabilities? Are they addressing open source management? Do they even care? Are they happy for vulnerabilities to happen because they say, you know what, we'll just take the reputational hit, but let's just keep pushing forward because we've got this government deadline. They want us to build this software by the end of 2-3 months, and we've just got to push it out. Right? So, of course, everyone's feeling the pressure of time, whether it's coming from the government contracting someone to build some software for the NHS in the UK, or whether it's Amazon or one of the big powerhouses of software, Google, trying to build their next feature, their next application, or an improvement to, example, Google Maps. Okay, everyone's feeling the pressure of time. Okay, and everyone's feeling the pressure of making sure they have a good CI/CD so they can catch all sorts of problems, not just vulnerabilities. They can catch bugs, they can catch regressions, right? This is all very much a big investment these companies are making, but of course they want to push things out as quickly as possible, and they want to eliminate things that reduce the time to get these new features out. And so, to prove to whoever it is that they're, making money, or prove that they've delivered on some sort of expectation. Um, and, after that ramble, I think then we can conclusively say that we should be addressing this open source security issue. We should be addressing the vulnerabilities in the open source packages, right? Because the companies care, the governments care, the individuals care, maintainers care, right? Because they want to be building a package which isn't buggy. They want to be building a package which people can enjoy. They enjoy the idea of people, benefiting from their time. I think that's a really nice, idea of the community. And it's almost like something in the shadows that's lying in wait, and we don't think it's necessarily going to creep up on us, right? And I think there's also a lack of information. There's a lack of data out there. I was speaking to someone a little while back from the NPM and JS community, and they were saying, they did a bit of information research about the number of vulnerabilities in Node.js packages, or packages you can get through NPM, right? And a lot of the data that was available online was saying, yeah, you'll find a few thousand, and in 2019, 2018, 2020, yeah, in the realm of thousands of vulnerabilities, right? But then he said, well, I started going through some packages myself. I started installing them, having a little play around. And then he said he was falling over cross-site scripting vulnerabilities. And he's saying, well, okay, if I'm doing this for 15 minutes and I've come across, 10 in about half an hour, how can there only be a few thousand vulnerabilities out there, right? So it shows there is various problems here, which is for the companies who want the information, they do want the alarms, they want their CI/CD to be broken as soon as an alarm comes in. Have we got enough data for that to even be, good quality? I'd argue absolutely not. We're playing, and for sure, it's good that the opportunity is being taken. But I think it's just important for us to realize corporations, any company or organization looking to build software with open source quickly, just needs to realize, they're not playing with a sure data set here. It's quite limited. And I think that's because of the massive challenge which is around it, which is there's a lot of open source, right? Before we were seeing enthusiasts and open source enthusiasts and ethical hackers kind of spending their own time, here and there, kind of, trying to find vulnerabilities and report them. And of course, we can see that the VCS providers, the source code repository providers like GitHub, also know this to be an issue, right? This is why they're looking at things like CodeQL. They want vulnerabilities to be found programmatically. They want automations that can find vulnerabilities, in so much of the open source that is out there, and of course, so much of the open source that is then being used by so much of society. So, big kind of holes here, right? And that's okay. Obviously, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It does have certain effects if we don't necessarily at least acknowledge the risks, which unfortunately, companies don't necessarily acknowledge. They don't even have a risk posture. They may not even have a security posture. And you may go through LinkedIn, or you may go through Twitter, or maybe you know people who 10 years ago, 15 years ago, they may not be in a security role, but security roles are maybe becoming more prolific, and I think that's a good thing. It shows that we're becoming a bit more security conscious. But I think we definitely need to consider how we're going to get about this. I certainly think that things like virtue signaling, which is, yeah, we got a bit of data which we can go off of, but do we really care about the open source package? Maybe, maybe not. I don't necessarily think this is the best way to approach this issue. I think it does need a community approach, just like proprietary software needed a community approach to be open source software. And the big guns were wrong about it. Microsoft were wrong about it, and they were so sure about it. And there are companies today who are very sure about their security posture, which is, okay, we're going to buy a $200,000-$300,000 contract with some company who provides a service that tells us what vulnerabilities are in certain packages, and that's it. That's it. And I think to an extent, okay, there are certain benefits in that. We've spoken about the data, gap, the data hole here, which is, we've got very limited data. There is for sure a lot more vulnerabilities out in the wild than what is being, fed to these companies and to organizations. So, if that's too far in the pipeline, and back to this idea of shifting left, we need to go back to the beginning, right? Which is, where is the code being built? Who is building the code? And who is looking at the code, right? And I think to an extent, that's what became of the innovation of open source. It wasn't just companies and people who were privately hired by organizations to build this code. It just became some private developer who went home and thought, you know what, I'm now going to go and build Lodash, or I'm now going to go home and build, requests or some sort of network promise or whatever, some sort of package which has changed the world with regards to software. And I think that's the evolution we'll see as well with open source security, which is a community will build around it. A community will naturally start to find these vulnerabilities, feel incentivized to go and find these vulnerabilities. And of course, naturally touching on Huntr, okay? We know I'm biased, okay? But putting that to the side, of course, we can still just, discuss these ideas critically. The problems are very similar, and it does need a community, I think, for this open source security issue, because it's so far to the left where, okay, well, the problem's not being solved in the CI/CD pipeline, right? I don't think these organizations are necessarily opening PRs. I think sometimes out of goodwill, they might, which is great. Okay, thumbs up. Thank you, Facebook, for spending a bit of time fixing, or, maybe even finding vulnerability and fixing it. But again, that's what we've got today, and we're saying that, what, we've got a few thousand vulnerabilities? I mean, it's clearly not enough, right? And again, not putting any blame on anyone here. Everyone's just trying to do their job, right? Whether it's the corporations, the governments, the non-profits, they're just looking to hit a time goal. They're looking to deliver something in that time, and that's it. Fair enough. Okay, thumbs up. But the question is, okay, so if it's not going to be in the CI/CD pipeline, and it's not going to be post-release, because that's where it's going to be in production, and the vulnerability is now live on production, you've got bad actors. They're going to go and run scripts. They're going to use all sorts of programs to try and evaluate whether there are vulnerabilities on these platforms. Okay, they find a vulnerability. What's next? Give it a few days, maybe a week, maybe a few weeks. Give it some time, some intelligence gathering. Okay, now we're in the news. We've just had a leak of 500 million records. Okay, and it can happen quick. Sometimes you read that these exploits, they do take time, to kind of deliver. The payloads take time to craft because the hacker or the bad actor, they don't want to be caught out, so they've got to consider what sort of processes they need to go through in order to make sure that they aren't caught during maybe some sort of supply chain attack. So these things can be very they can be crafted over quite a long time. And of course, there can also be attacks which, just because, I don't know, there's been some sort of rumor that there's a vulnerability, or there's some sort of public knowledge, or maybe there's not public knowledge, someone goes and tries to exploit the vulnerability. So we know it's not there. We know it's not in the CI/CD pipeline. but the vulnerabilities are coming from the open source community. And this is absolutely not saying that the open source community is doing something bad or wrong. Of course there's going to be vulnerabilities in the code that we're writing, right? Open source software is being built for people who want to move quickly. It's being built for people who want to create their own innovations, who want to have fun, who want to experiment, who want to move from ground zero to 100 quickly. And I think that's amazing. And I think that's why we're seeing things like these COVID alert apps that were built up during the pandemic. GitHub specifically, I remember there was lots of repositories and some really popular ones which sprung up quickly. It was about building some dashboards and pulling data quickly together. I mean, go back in time a bit, and I mean, you could think of this stuff as impossible. You'd need some sort of organization that was incentivized. You'd need the organization to have money. They'd need to ask some sort of contractor to build it for them. And then the contractor would respond, okay, give us 12 months. That sounds reasonable, and we'll deliver it from finish to end. But in comes open source software, in comes iterative development. Awesome, releasing this stuff really quickly, and it benefits humanity. And that's why we're not necessarily putting the blame here on the open source community, and we're not necessarily also putting the full blame on the corporations, the organizations, and the non-profits that are using open source either. But I think it's more just a realization that will come over time, just like what happened with proprietary software, which is, okay, this is something that we can't just address reactively. It's affecting people's lives. It's affecting people's data, right? We're having these leaks. We're having phone numbers, credit cards being extorted, being released to the public, being released on all sorts of platforms, and then being used further, maybe even sometimes, forever against an individual. I mean, most people don't know how to prevent themselves from being continuously phished. I think most people would say, like this Gmail account or my email account is now just being bombarded with phishing. Okay, most people say, actually, I'm gonna now get a new email account. But a lot of people don't know that. Some people may think they're legitimate emails. Some people may still keep clicking on them, and then it's installing all sorts of rubbish, whether it's a remote access tool, or whether it's like something that listens to their microphone or takes pictures, and then you've got the opportunity to threaten an individual, all of which are, really bad things that are affecting people's lives. And it does happen, right? And it could be because of something like an open source vulnerability, which cascades, and then they get a leak, and then this data is out on the internet, and then you've got people being targeted more, and people don't necessarily know how to protect themselves as much. So you can really see like why this idea of shift left is having such an amplification effect on society. The corporations, they want to move quickly. They want to get their awesome features out, which everyone on the planet is using. Okay, awesome. I use Facebook. I love this new feature. I'm going to go ahead and put in my birthday. I'm going to go ahead and put in my phone number. And I'm also going to go ahead and put in whatever. I don't know, my social security number. Let's just imagine that Facebook asked that. Maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't. Okay, actually, oh gosh, there's a vulnerability in the open source package we use. It's pretty fundamental to the website. It's now exposed an endpoint which allows users to get user data. Oh, and by the way, I'm a bad actor. I'm going to go and put it somewhere publicly online. And then you've got the effect to people who don't necessarily know how to protect themselves, but do want to use these services which are innovating, like Facebook connecting people, Snapchat, sending pictures, Twitter, making shorts, announcements, whatever it is. So very much an amplification effect, all the way from something as just as simple as, a pull request, which is crazy, that someone who's only trying to act in a good way, they create a pull request, maybe it's their first or maybe it's their 1,000th time creating a pull request, they're contributing to a small, a medium, or a massive package, right? It doesn't necessarily matter because we do see attacks, supply chain attacks, open source vulnerabilities cascading even from very small packages or even, massive packages naturally, all the way to the end of what we've just spoken about. And I think this is where we need to address the issue, right? We need to address it at the beginning of the pipeline. What is it that we're building, right? Of course, we can't expect that when people are writing the open source component or some software or some building up some new open source repository, that every single line of code that they write is completely vulnerability free. But I think what we can try to push for is a critically thinking society or critically thinking community, which is, like this is an interesting open source packages that is used for building charts. But have you considered that there could be a cross-site scripting vulnerability here, which allows the user to inject a payload into your chart? Oh, you're using this live on production. You're using it for some sort of data platform, which is being used by, I don't know, Cloudflare, AWS. You may want to look into this, right? And we've said there are good do-gooders, and there are people who are acting out of goodwill and want to help the open source community from a security perspective. But I think to an extent, maybe there's not enough incentivization for people to do it, and also maybe there just hasn't been enough of recognition that this is where we need more talent, right? And I think it's a knock-on effect, which is, the more people in society talk about things, I think people flock to these things. Security may be included. If it's in the news, maybe someone who's, young and looking to get into a new career may think, I want to get started in cybersecurity. I read it in the news. Seems cool. I think that's an interesting effect, even if it's as a result of something negative, maybe even because of a data leak. So I think we certainly need more of these eyes, not to say that any, only specific people can do it. I think it's just we need people to get started, basically, right? We need people to get started in open source security, in security, just as much as people want to get started with open source, right? And we've said that GitHub is trying to address this issue, getting people started in open source, because we've seen such an incredible effect it has. And I think it would see a very similar result. Even people who are new to the game, people who want to get started in security, or people who are just curious, I think they do absolutely have the capability to, read through some repositories, have a look at some files, start from the ground up, understand what JavaScript is, understanding simple functions in JavaScript. And you don't have to look very, very far, to find these vulnerabilities necessarily, just as we said in the example before, which is we're preaching this idea that there's only a few thousand vulnerabilities out there, but you can stumble on and on through certain packages, and it's quite likely that you will find something like a cross-site scripting or a prototype pollution, right? And I think to an extent there is a concern from society, but mostly corporations, anyone interested in building these applications, that there's going to be a lot of noise, right? And this is where the issue really comes in, which is I don't want to hear it because I don't want it to slow me down, right? And whether you can understand this position or not, it's not necessarily a healthy position to have. And I think the position is held because it's like, okay, well, what can we do about it? Like, okay, you're going to find, 50,000 vulnerabilities in open source packages, and then we're using, a few hundred of those. Like, we just can't, we haven't got the time, right? And I think this is it. People in society, generally, it's difficult to deal with uncomfortabilities. And I think it's the same with corporations. I think it's the same with anyone who's using open source software. They just want to feel like, absolutely, this addresses the functionality I need. It's perfect. I can customize it. I can add the colors. I can make it relevant to our brand. And I can stick it straight to production, right? Of course, we don't want it to have any bugs in it. But they're relying on these vulnerability databases. They're relying on information from the public, which, as we've said, may or may not be lacking. And again, that's not to blame people who are doing it for goodwill. It's not to blame people who are curious in finding vulnerabilities in their spare time. But it just shows, to an extent, that there's just not enough of a community or an effort around it yet. And I think hopefully we see an improvement there. I really do. For sure. And again, I don't want to be particularly biased, but I think this is something we've got a really good shot at with huntr, right? I think to an extent, people need to feel incentivized, right? Whether it's they enjoy going on a certain platform for whatever reason, it doesn't necessarily have to be money. It doesn't necessarily have to be X, Y, and Z. People may come and interact for different reasons, okay? But I think there needs to be something there that pulls these people in who are for sure out there. There are people who are security capable, and there are also people who aren't security capable yet, but they can very quickly become security capable, right? Just like the GitHub analogy, they're looking for new people, and they for sure must believe there are people out there. Otherwise, why would they be, spending effort, spending feature time, UI time on trying to address, good first issue? They wouldn't necessarily if they didn't think this. And they've got a hell of a lot of data on the community of software, open source software as well. But I think it's the same with us as well, which is it doesn't necessarily need to be the full-on security expert. It just needs to be someone who's looking to get started, someone who's looking to play around with open source security. Maybe they've had a little play around or a little read around with cybersecurity, and they want to understand how it really affects the end result, which is the news articles, big breaches, all of this data has been leaked, yada, 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 right? And I think, of course, it can be quite intimidating to getting started with software, right? I think that's just almost a misconception. And I think it's good to see that as a society we're kind of embracing programming more. Brilliant, thumbs up. And in that light, if this is true, I think for sure, I enjoy programming. I'd love to know, I'd love to see what bit of code is being used on, I don't know, dominoes.com. It'd be cool for me to like actually read the code, look through line by line what code is being used on dominoes.com or being used on facebook.com or being used on google.com, whatever.co.uk. Um, and I think that's the beauty of open source, which is it's very transparent. You can learn very quickly because everything's so transparent. There's so much documentation. There's so much of a community around it that it's very unlikely you're not going to pick up things that you're struggling to understand very quickly. And I literally think this can be the same with open source security. We can have documentation around open source security. We can have repositories being built with, information around improved security, or someone to go to, get these security fixes or these security disclosures, right? I think it's very much just getting the community, making them feel incentivized, pulling them towards a central place where they can address these concerns, whether that be, I want to just get started in open source security, I want to understand how a security vulnerability in the wild or in the public started, how it can start, how it can transpire from a bit of code, all the way to my information being leaked. I think anyone who's looking for these opportunities, plus people who are looking for opportunities to improve their CV, looking for opportunities to improve their practical experience, anyone who's just looking for a bit of fun, anyone who's looking just to contribute to open source even, right? All of these opportunities here lie in wait with regards to open source security. And so, it's a big challenge. It's very much a steeper challenge as how do we get people to move away from proprietary to something like open source software. Not the same problem, but similar aspects with people have the capability, but how do we pull in the eyes? They have the interest, but where do they go? If you find a vulnerability in an open source repository, I mean, do you feel very confident as to who to go to, like where to initiate the conversation? Do you feel confident that you're going to be rewarded if you want to be? Do you feel that you're going to get the recognition if you want the recognition? Do you feel that you're going to be able to document it properly on your CV so you can show it to your new employer? Or are you going to have to show them some pull request or some commit? So, and again, this isn't necessarily the fault of certain providers. Platforms like GitHub, they have a very specific purpose, which is, they're a place for repositories, a place for maintainers to build out their repositories, and that's fair enough. But we can see just generally, just discussing some of these ideas, discussing what may be missing, that there isn't necessarily a place where we can address all of these issues, right? And again, obviously biased, I'm going to be, but hopefully this is what huntr can be, which is if someone feels like they found a vulnerability or they want to find a vulnerability, they know they can come to us too. Okay, fix the vulnerability or find the vulnerability, come here to speak to the maintainer to do it on an equal playing field, right? Because we've spoken about this before. Open source maintainers, whether it's a good thing or not, they can be quite proud or they can just be very, sure of what they want in their package. But I think to an extent, it's good to kind of pull away those, foundations and bring an equal level playing field where you can discuss these vulnerabilities. Plus the opportunity to be able to show off your reputation, whether it's on something like a leaderboard, or whether it's something like on your profile, something that demonstrates, what you've really contributed to something in the open. And the difference between this and, vulnerabilities found with other programs and other bug bounty programs is you can't necessarily really display your result. You can't necessarily, sorry, you can display your result, but you can't necessarily display like what it is you actually did, for a certain amount of time. Or, in some cases, you may not be able to really talk so much about, what the vulnerability was or so much how you fixed it. Of course, there are some programs which will say, after 2 months or after 3 months or after 30 days, you can. But the beauty with open source is it's all there in the open anyway. You can address these issues generally in the public, and you can show this off. You can feel proud. You can talk about it with other people. You can show it to people who are interested in getting started and say, yeah, absolutely. This is how I found the vulnerability. This is where I found it, and I can point you straight to it. It's more transparent. It's more visible, and I think for that reason, it's more workable. So Yeah, I mean I guess that's my spiel. Any thoughts on that, Ben?
Yeah, so like to start at the beginning, almost like I think the internet has evolved a lot. If we think back 20 years, social networks and whatnot weren't really around. We didn't really have Facebook. It certainly wasn't mainstream. I don't think it even existed, to be honest. But now society and the internet has kind of evolved, and it's almost like social networks and society makes up a lot of the internet now. So like whether that is Reddit, Facebook, Instagram, all these social networks, people are contributing to conversations. They're communicating with one another, and this makes up a massive part of the internet. And that's where a lot of our information comes from. Whereas before, like 20 years ago, you'd maybe go on the internet to r- research something, or maybe like some individuals posted a website, let's say for example about space, and you could maybe learn about like the temperature on Mars or something like this. But now it's evolved to the point where we can contribute to the code that is being used on Mars, like Ingenuity, like you've mentioned. So now that society is like such a massive part of the internet, it's now like individuals that are contributing to the software. But now I think society also needs to be more aware of the security aspect. And like you mentioned, like we're only seeing like a few thousand vulnerabilities being reported, but this math doesn't quite add up when you see how many repositories there are out there. And yeah, I think we just need to get that message across to society, because we've went from kind of social media into open source and people contributing. Um, Now anyone can get involved, whether it's blog posts or whatnot. Now people can also contribute to the software, and now we need to try get people on board and contributing to the security aspect as well, because we need to protect this layer of the internet, which is so great, so transparent, and gives us all this freedom to either learn or just have comfortability, like a comfort when you're using software, because you can see the code, you can even suggest edits to the code, create new features. So yeah, I think this is an evolution, uh, because like I said, when you compare it to 20 years ago, it's completely changed, and we're starting to see this shift where uh, any individual can start contributing. And I think we need to start seeing more contributions in terms of security, and especially in open source. Um, and I think we're giving people that opportunity, and incentivizing that opportunity, and we're getting this ball rolling so that people can become more security aware, and um, make these contributions, and be rewarded for their efforts, and get the reputation they deserve, so that they can then build on that, whether that's getting into a security based job or a software based job. But a platform like Hunter, to build a profile and have a place where you can show these contributions off, and not that you should show them off, but you deserve to have a place where you can showcase what you've done, because it's these individuals that make up the internet, and or protect the internet, and they deserve to have that platform where they can showcase these efforts.
Yeah, for sure. No, 100%. I think the community will feel incentivized to get involved, to to start addressing these issues if they feel like they're getting something in return. And for sure, we said it's different for everybody. Everyone has their different needs and they have their different wants. But I think in
Yeah.
this light, for sure, if we can see a platform that starts to address these incentives that people want, then we can say that as a community, as a society, we may proactively address this issue of open source security. And one thing that I just wanted to kind of show on stream and also talk about was this whole idea of red alarms, alerts being displayed to even the open source maintainers and to some extent also the corporations and organizations using this open source software, right? So percentage of active repositories that receive Dependabot alerts. So Dependabot is a bot that is used on GitHub, and it will display or alert to users about vulnerabilities that are in repositories either that an organization is using or is for the maintainer and tells them that there may be a vulnerability here because it's been reported to some extent, right? But we can see pretty high numbers for some of these. So for JavaScript, 72.8% of active repositories receive Dependabot alerts. 81.4% of Ruby repositories receive Dependabot alerts. And for sure, this doesn't necessarily show the frequency and the number of Dependabot alerts, just shows the number of repositories using it. But the question is, can we really respond to all of these Dependabot alerts? Do we need something more proactive as opposed to reactive, which is vulnerability here, fix it, vulnerability there, fix it, right? And then also, let's just scroll down to the life cycle, and this was something we've discussed quite a lot together, which is the full life cycle of a vulnerability. So we've got undetected vulnerability, alerting users to upgrade, fix known vulnerability, and users upgrading to fixed version. And look how long, look how many weeks it goes undetected, right? And surely this shows us that we are not addressing this enough as a society more proactively. I mean, we can basically say what's in pink here is society, the open source security community or open source community or developers saying, yeah, we don't really want to look for it proactively. We're kind of focused on developing quickly at the end. You see, in comparison to undetected vulnerability, look at the amount of time it takes, just over 200 weeks. Look how quickly it's patched in green. Users upgrading to fixed version. So we can confirm that we're very good at fixing things, and we can confirm that we're very good at patching things, right? But how incentivized and how good are we at finding these vulnerabilities? And I think, from GitHub's Octoverse 2020 security report, they've got the data, they've got the millions of repositories. And I think it's pretty fair to say that, these undetected vulnerabilities, they are for sure out there. There are, there's not going to be a few thousand if this is the case. It's probably going to be higher, hundreds of thousands, who knows, maybe even millions, right? Because if they're lying in wait to this much, 200 weeks, what is this?
It's too long.
200 divided by, let's say, 52. So the next time I may hear about a vulnerability which currently exists today, I will be 4 years older. Let's say it becomes like, let's say there's a package today which becomes vulnerable today. It's possible the next time that vulnerability gets detected is in 4 years from now. I mean, it's crazy, right? And in this time,
Yeah.
in this pink region, hundreds, thousands, maybe even hundreds and hundreds of thousands of companies are using these packages which have undetected vulnerabilities. And what does it say? People are not incentivized to address this issue. Or they don't feel like they want to address this issue. They want to address it at the end of the pipeline where they've already got the software in their products or in their applications. And okay, let's address it here. That's it. Like, we haven't got the time. We don't necessarily feel like we're incentivized to address it earlier. So, I mean, that's pretty indicative,
Yeah, no, it's a scary thought, and to think, for 4 years to stay like insecure, like you wouldn't leave your front door open for 4 years, like the chances are something's going to happen, so something bad's going to happen. So
Yeah,
it's
100%.
a very scary number, but it's very good that GitHub is, addressing this and making this available to the public so that we can try tackle this head on, because it's a very obvious problem, especially when you see graphs like this.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
And it needs to be addressed. And the sooner it's addressed, the more damage we can stop from happening,
Yeah.
and protect software and protect people.
Yeah, 100%. And just to kind of pull down on some more of these graphs. So what I'd recommend is if you have not read GitHub's Octoverse 2020 security report, you may think, it's going to be really technical, it's going to be really confusing, I won't understand it. It is really good. I'd really recommend it, even if you're not security or technically inclined. It just says a lot about software. It says a lot about security. If you're interested in getting a bit more information in there, for sure would recommend going ahead and reading this. But just pulling down to another graph, so time to identify and fix a vulnerability by severity, right? So you may say, Ben, right, okay, at least the low and the moderate ones, at least they're the high ones. But I mean, even still,
Mhm.
looking at high and critical, I mean, what, 5 years? Time to identify and fix a vulnerability. So maybe this doesn't, this is just median. But I mean, wow, 5 years to identify a vulnerability. Let's say it's identified today. It exists today. The vulnerability is created today. It could take 5 years for a high severity vulnerability to be identified and fixed. And then even with critical, so it really, really has an impact. Like this could be the data leaks. This could be admin privileges. This could be DDoSes. This could be taking down servers. This could be supply chain attacks. This could be affecting governments, massive organizations, charities, whatever it is, right? Even here, we've got 3 years to identify and fix a vulnerability. And you know what this graph shows? It shows that we are really ignoring the issue. Maybe we'll care a bit about the really dangerous stuff, but yeah, even still, like give us 3 years, you know? For everything else, like because it's not critical, we'll leave it, you know? Or
Yeah,
we'll rely on open source generally just to build this package and then we'll respond to our alarms, you know? Which may or may not come
yeah,
about in those few years. So I think the data definitely demonstrates the issue, right? I think to an extent we're not just talking out of our mouths. I think there's some things to back this up. I think GitHub's source of data is reliable, and I think this report is brilliant. Um, Cumulative percentage dependent on alerts resolved by severity over time, more secure automation. Yeah, potential vulnerabilities found in source code scale with lines of code written. Also, a really awesome graph, right? So the number of vulnerabilities found in source code with the number of lines of code written. So let's take a look. The number of lines of code written, we can see that it's gone up and up and up and up over time, really quite quickly as well. So just before 2016, we're starting at 0, let's say, and then we're almost at, 70, 75, 76 million, let's call it, lines of code. And we can see potential vulnerabilities is really following it, and it's catching up. If we look at where we were at the beginning, interesting analysis to be had there. They were somewhat close to each other, but I think that's more, the platform's fresh, people are getting used to developing repositories, the community is building out, people are coming, people are leaving. But as, the community is becoming more and more solid and the number of lines of code, are growing, you can see to an extent that, as we go to the top end here, that it's coming back close to each other again, which is, you're seeing these rapid increases in the number of potential vulnerabilities. So it's not an issue that's just going to go away. It's definitely an issue that we need to address, and we need to address it, continuously. It's not just like this is the solution and now we're done. I think it's something just as continuous and infinite, or kind of infinite, so not to the fullest extent, as open source. It must be, especially if the number of potential vulnerabilities is so heavily correlated and related to the number of lines of code. So the problem exists. We know that it's not just going to be a one solution, one stop kind of fix for it, and that's why I think we can say, absolutely unbiased, obviously, I think that Huntr can be a good shot at this. Bringing and understanding the users who do have these skills into an arena where they can address these security issues, where they feel like they're incentivized to do it, whether it's for money, whether it's for their CVs, whether it's for their friends and family to, look at their profile and say, awesome, you found all these vulnerabilities, right? So let's take a look. I think to an extent, people do want to be able to show off their vulnerabilities. I think people do want to, not necessarily their vulnerabilities, but they want to be able to show off, their their content, their what they've learned, like what they did, how they worked with a maintainer, how they found a vulnerability, how they fixed it. And I think for sure, like again, biased, I think Hunter is a good place to do that. And we're still obviously from a developmental perspective trying to understand, what incentivizes a community to find and fix vulnerabilities. Are the incentives different for the person who's looking to find a vulnerability? Are the incentives different for the person who's looking to disclose to fix a vulnerability? Are the incentives different for the maintainer? Of course, the maintainer needs to be involved in this conversation as well, right? The person or the individual or the individuals who are going to get this fix, merged and eventually released to the public. So it's very much understanding what these incentives are, developing this, and I suppose testing like any other kind of organization will try to do when building a product. But that's very much where I think the solution lies here, right? When we go back to these graphs and we see the potential vulnerabilities are skyrocketing with the number of lines of code, we see the amount of time to find and fix these vulnerabilities in the scale of years, which for sure I think if people in industry took a look at these graphs and just had a frank conversations with their teams and with themselves and reflected, I think we can all say this is just it's not really acceptable, and it's not putting the blame on any individual. It's more what innovations are out there that can help us address this issue because it's having an effect on society, and that's it. Here's the problem. How can we get around this? And I think being more proactive, understanding people's incentives, bringing researchers and reporters of vulnerabilities closer to the maintainer, doing it on a platform that is literally designed around this, I think this is for sure a nice way to kind of address these issues that we're seeing here. Years and years to find and fix vulnerabilities. An increasing number of vulnerabilities or potential vulnerabilities as more and more of code is written. So absolutely. I think that's
No, I
kind of
think
our
you're
layout
right.
of it.
And yeah, and I think it's about bringing the security conscious to collaborate with the maintainers that are maybe not so security conscious. Like,
Yeah.
granted, they're very much fantastic software developers, but bringing these two communities together to collaborate and bring this these metrics that we see on the GitHub report, we need to bring these down because we're reaching dangerous territory,
Yeah.
especially as more and more lines are being written and it's being more widely adopted. It's and this scary thought of being vulnerable for 5 years. We need to crunch this down massively, and I think we're tackling this head on and bringing these two communities together so that we can collaborate in terms of security and not just software.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure, for sure. And I think what would be nice for us next time, I know, we're quite fresh with live streaming here, and obviously we'll get the recording up on YouTube as well. I think it'll be up pretty quickly. But what we can do next time is we can run through Hunter. We can kind of express some of the things that we think we're addressing today, some of the things that we don't feel we're addressing yet, and we can talk about what we're developing, what we're working on, and also it'd be good to hear, from people hopefully that are in stream, or maybe get some questions in the comments after. So, to an extent, it's important for us to speak to the communities, the open source communities, the ethical hacking community, the open source security community, and understand, do they need incentivization, or is it they just don't really know where to get started, but they have the skills, right? And it's understanding all these things that we're really eager to do as well. And we want to kind of pull out all of these experiences and understandings from people who are engaging with us and part of different communities. So maybe that's what we look to do for our next episode. But I think we're kind of coming to a close. I think we've covered an awesome amount of stuff here. What I'll do is I'll get a lot of the links that we've covered around the Mars helicopter, Amazon Fresh. I'll leave some link on there. I'll maybe get something with a bit more technical explanation as to how it works with the cameras. I'll get the GitHub Octaverse security report, which is with all these beautiful graphs explaining the open source security state. And I guess we'll wrap up there. I mean, unless there's any questions from anyone in the Discord. We don't have the comments on YouTube working, unfortunately, but we will try and get that sorted for next time. Next week, 6 p.m. UK, every week. Any questions from anyone in the Discord? Just you can raise your hand with the button. Show. Just raise hand. No questions yet. No worries. Cool. All right. Well, I think that's it from us. Again, we'll be here next week, every Monday, 6 p.m. till 7 p.m. roughly. I know we went a bit over. But yeah, 6 p.m. till 7 p.m., 1 hour. We'll cover open source, we'll cover hacking, we'll cover bug bounty, and of course, we'll also cover huntr.dev. And of course, if you're interested, all the links are in the description. If you want to disclose a vulnerability or you just want to read more about our community, we've got a blog. We've also got all of our users' profiles up and running. You can check out the leaderboard, see who's kind of, waving the flag at the front and fixing the most vulnerabilities and also finding the most vulnerabilities. We'd encourage you to kind of take a look. And of course, naturally, we want to hear your feedback. If you think you have certain strong opinions about the platform, we would love to hear it. So if you want to do that through our Discord, also link in the description. Yeah, I guess thanks for joining us if you made it this far. But we'll wrap up there and see you all next week.
Yeah, thank you very much, and yeah, have a good day wherever you are in the rest of the world. And yeah, thanks again, Jamie, and until next week.
Yeah, cheers, Ben. See you all soon.
Thank you very much. Bye bye.
Bye bye.